Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, we have a very important ballot initiative here in Massachusetts on November 6, 2012. Not only are we voting for president, but we're voting for something that could affect every single citizen's life here in Massachusetts. It's called, by the proponents of this particular ballot initiative, Death with Dignity. Those that are on the pro-life side call it something else, doctor-prescribed suicide. Recently, Vermont has been fighting this battle for year in and year out for quite some time, and we have the Executive Director of Vermont Right to Life, Mary Beerworth, on the line with us. Welcome, Mary.
How are you?
Mary, tell us a little bit about what kind of things that you've seen. Now, you've been experiencing this battle for quite some time. What's gone on in Vermont, and how have you been dealing with this particular issue?
Well, it's been a fascinating about 24 years, actually, Brendan. Those promoters of death with dignity or assisted suicide, or what we call doctor-prescribed suicide, have focused like a laser on Vermont for the past at least 12 years. And so they have brought considerable out-of-state funds to Vermont and have forced the issue to the forefront of the legislative agenda.
Now, is that a lot of New York money coming into Vermont?
No, it's mostly Oregon-driven money. The
Really?
headquarters for the Death with Dignity folks is in Oregon, and they have openly stated to the press and the media that they are funding the effort here in Vermont.
I see. And weren't they called some other name prior to this? Weren't the
Well, the group goes back to the early 1970s here in Vermont, and they openly called themselves the Hemlock Society. Since then, their name has undergone several transformations to Death with Dignity, to Compassionate Choices, and now finally End-of-Life Choices. No, in fact, I'm sorry, Brendan, last year they called themselves Patient Choices at End of Life.
I see.
But same group, same team running the show. Of course, Vermont likes to be considered first in just about everything. So they did see Vermont as an easy target. They want to expand their efforts into the Northeast. And naturally, you would choose Vermont. We certainly have quite a reputation. As I told you before, it's a different little state. We were the first to abolish slavery, and since then we've been first in some very key liberal left agenda items. But this one has hit a roadblock, and each time it's come up. First time in 2007. Now we're talking about a legislative body, 150 members of the House. This cannot in any way be drawn up as a Republican versus Democrat issue or even a pro-life, pro-choice issue. This divided a majority House of Democrats right down the middle. And House Democrat leadership went to the floor believing they had the votes in 2007, only to be defeated on a roll call vote of 82 to 63. In fact, in Vermont, it isn't just Democrats and Republicans. There's a number of independents and progressives who are to the left of Democrats. And those voting against this legislation, recognizing the risks and the dangers of such a public policy, were found in every one of those political groups.
Well, for instance, maybe we could take a look at one of the myths that the other side tries to sell. They say, I just want to take a pill to end my life.
And that one, we have to really clearly look at this, because just the truth of the matter is that there is no such thing as a single pill that you take to end your life. This is a very messy process. It involves at least 90 pills of a lethal dose. You either have to try to swallow those before you begin to vomit them back up, or begin to lose consciousness before you finish. And there are cases, even as recent as 2011 in Oregon, where the patients simply were not successful and did not die. And in some cases, they're worse off than they were before they tried to take the pills. Now, the proponents of this bill will say, oh, but they come in capsules. I'm not sure if you can see up on your screen, like about 25 of the capsules, you need another 60 in order to equal a lethal dose. But they say, oh, in Oregon, you can break those up and put them in applesauce. Well, this is a very, very bitter drug. It is barbiturates, and it's very difficult to swallow. And it increases whenever you put something in a food. It increases the likelihood that someone else may feed a vulnerable person the lethal dose.
I see. And now, one of their other myths that they use, one of their arguments, it's about choice. We've seen this in the abortion movement, of course. What would you say about that particular myth?
Well, that sells very well here in Vermont. There's no question that Vermont is a choice state. If it's about individual rights and liberties, Vermont is for it. And so, of course, our initial public opinion polls put some very high numbers of Vermonters in favor of legalizing doctor-prescribed suicide. But it is a myth that it's about choice. The sad fact, Brendan, is that there are no laws left in any of our 50 states in the United States of America against taking your own life. And it's very sad that our emergency rooms are full of those who have successfully decided to do so. The reason this is a myth about choice is because the proponents of this bill cannot convince us that by the very fact of legalizing this choice, they won't be putting the vulnerable, disabled folks at risk of feeling that they have no choice, that they are a burden, and that they quietly need to go and get out of the way because of financial reasons or because it's very difficult to take care of them. And that's the key question right there. This in Vermont has been the sticking point. The disability groups have come out in force to say, don't put vulnerable lives at risk by passing this legislation. And that is probably dispelling the myth of choice, because some people will feel they have no choice but to ask for this lethal dose. That has been the single biggest argument against passage in Vermont.
And I see, what about the doctor-patient relationship? Couldn't the doctor, albeit they'll do it in subtle ways, but wouldn't they also try to push that person who's... Now, I understand they have to be, mentally competent? They cannot be, quote, mentally incompetent to take this. But couldn't they subtly push?
And that, of course, is up to an individual doctor to determine. And obviously there are reasons to believe that it's being practiced outside of those constraints in Oregon, and there are stories that have made it into the press. But the other forefront group in Vermont was a group called the Vermont Alliance for Ethical Healthcare. And our Vermont Medical Society did take a position against this legislation, and a group was formed to promote the provision of excellent health care at the end of life in an ethical manner and to oppose any effort to legalize physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia in Vermont. And those two voices now that we've discussed, the disability folks and the Vermont Alliance for Ethical Healthcare, they were the central players in the Vermont legislature. They came down with convincing arguments, and the other side, those in favor of the so-called death with dignity, have failed to persuade. Some of their very own, some very, very liberal thinking legislators were failed to be persuaded. So the danger in Massachusetts is that Massachusetts citizens need to know that the deliberative process turns this legislation down in state after state after state.
So you really have to dig in on the issues. I know that here in Massachusetts, our medical society voted it down, saying they did not support this particular upcoming referendum. Has that been the case in Vermont or in other states?
Yes, it usually is that the medical societies understand that this would be fundamentally incompatible with their role as healers. And they usually take a very strong position against. And that did happen here in Vermont, and it has happened. More than 75% of your medical society reaffirmed their opposition to assisted suicide.
Now, Mary, I'd like to discuss another myth that this Death with Dignity, formerly the Hemlock Society, purports. It says everything is working well in Oregon. What do they mean by that?
Well, that is very powerful, and until you can dispel that myth, it becomes quite probably their most convincing argument. It's important to understand that the Oregon Department of Health doesn't have a lot of authority to investigate how these deaths actually occur. They keep track of the number of written prescriptions and the number of deaths, but what happens in between is not carefully tracked, and they're very open about admitting that. So we have Oregon promoters of this law they've come to Vermont for years now. They bring their big guns in. They get a tour of the State House. Vermont's governor is very much in favor of this law. And they sort of set up shop here, and they always tell us everything is working beautifully in Oregon. So this is another one of the myths that we have to dispel. First of all, there's always a possibility that when you legalize something that involves the taking of someone's life, are we sending a message to young people that we are sort of giving permission that it's okay to commit suicide? And there was a lot of controversy and testimony surrounding that idea. In one particular case, it was a former legislator who formally supported this legislation, but her 19-year-old son committed suicide, and she came to plead with the senators in 2012 that the message you send is not always the message that is received by a young person, and that a young person could well believe that it is okay to participate in suicide for themselves. So we looked at rising suicide rates in Oregon. Certainly Vermont has rising suicide rates here. We've went up about 15% just in the last 2 years. And in the early years of the Oregon experiment with physician-assisted suicide, there were several cases that made it to the forefront, and a couple of recent cases as well. There's Kate Cheney, and you can certainly Google search for her, but she was an elderly woman who had early dementia, and a couple of doctors said, no, she doesn't seem to want to take her own life. Her daughter seems to want her to take her own life, because she was getting elderly and was inconvenient, is the supposition. So eventually the daughter took Kate Cheney doctor shopping to find someone who would write the prescription. And that's a case that we feel is that where the law is being implemented outside the safeguards and constraints that were in the original law. So Pat Matheny invited his brother-in-law to help to be there when he took the drugs, and his brother-in-law publicly testified afterward that it was very difficult, and in the end he had to, quote-unquote, help his brother-in-law die. And, of course, Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroup made very recent headlines when because their Oregon health plan denied their doctor's prescription for life-extending drugs and offered to pay the amount that it would cost to provide them with a lethal dose.
So how much would a legal dose cost to kill you versus, say, a life-saving prescription or activity to keep you alive?
The drugs were prescribed by the doctors to extend their life and also to decrease their pain and improve their quality of life, and those drugs cost about $4,000 a month. The cost for a lethal dose we believe right now runs between $50 and $100 total.
Wow, I see. Well, this would certainly make the profit-driven HMOs certainly would want to encourage people then to take suicide pills, wouldn't it?
You know, it's going to be impossible to predict how this will come out, but certainly when you talk about health care, all of the conversation is about cost containment and saving money on the bottom line, and it's just something that has to be faced. In 2011, a prominent editorial was printed in a pretty expansive weekly that's produced out of Addison County. And the editor was interviewing our head of the new healthcare law here in Vermont, and they agreed that this type of legislation would decrease the cost of delivering healthcare. So I don't think it's something we can ignore and pretend isn't on the table.
Now, would a state like Massachusetts, which currently has health care for all their citizens, supposedly, and therefore the premiums are increasing in the private sector amongst citizens here in Massachusetts, and therefore rationing is soon to occur. Would rationing further propel people for doctors to incentivize them to give people in the last stages of their life a doctor-prescribed suicide pills?
I don't think we can get away from what may well be happening here. There are those of us who would feel that we would never take our own lives, but if you make someone's life miserable enough, I would say that they could subject all of us to that temptation to ask for a lethal dose.
In the pro-life community, we've seen oftentimes, particularly with young girls who are underage, they go to a judge, and the judge will say that this person can have an abortion, even though she's not of legal age. Would we find that? Would that occur for the elderly, where only certain doctors would prescribe the death pills themselves? Have we got any history of that?
Well, they call it doctor shopping, and they call it that for a reason, because in Oregon, where we do have some data to look at, most of the prescriptions were written by just a very small group of doctors. So there's sort of like a chain of events. You call, if you want a lethal dose, you call us the Compassion and Choices, I believe their name is, in Oregon, and they put you right in touch with the doctors who will write the prescriptions. It's known there that some doctors are prominent prescribers of lethal barbiturates for assisted suicide, and some doctors only know their patients for 1 week before writing the prescriptions. Mm-hmm. So when they talk about safeguards and how to protect, and you're going to hear more of this in the weeks leading up to the ballot initiative, but those safeguards do not hold.
So they're really ineffective, or they're not. Are there other safeguards that they try to put in there to blunt the pro-life side of the argument?
Well, and let's be very clear, on this one there is not a pro-life or pro-choice side of the argument, as we saw here in Vermont. It's simply those of us who were pro-life actually were more bystanders and observers of what was happening in the State House, because this went so far beyond pro-life and pro-choice. This became a public policy matter that people met in the middle about. Politicians who generally disagree on everything came together on this to defeat it. We talked about 2007, but just as recently as 2012, an attempt was defeated in our Senate. There are 30 members of the Senate. One was absent for the day, but the end result was 18-11. They voted this down. Mm-hmm. And that's in a very liberal state that normally goes for choice, but it simply became too alarming to think about the negative results of such a move. So one of the other safeguards they talk about when they talk about Oregon is that there will be a consult for depression. It's just well documented that when you get a diagnosis of a terminal illness, you will experience some significant depression, which can be helped by good palliative care and wraparound support. But as recently as last year in Oregon, only one patient was, referred to a depression consult. Only one out of over 70 deaths.
Well, that's quite something.
Yeah.
And let me ask you, how would the doctor-patient relationship change then for end-of-life people?
Well, I think you would no longer be able to trust that your doctor was there in the room, only concerned about making you as comfortable as possible at the end of life. One of the things we experienced here in Vermont was we had some excellent doctors who testified about the advanced state of palliative care and how well they are doing in making you comfortable and controlling pain. And so would your doctor be going to bat for you to keep you alive and keep you comfortable? I don't think anyone's talking about extraordinary care that keeps you alive longer than you want. And that's something we haven't touched upon. It is very important for anyone listening to this show to understand that you already have the right to reject all and any medical treatment. If a doctor treats you anyway, that doctor can be prosecuted. You can decide at any time to discontinue any treatment, and you should lay out your end-of-life wishes in a document. That is very important. So we already have a lot of rights that surround the right to die, but now we're entering into a different realm. Should physicians write a prescription for a lethal dose and send you home to decide whether or not to take that dose by yourself?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, what do you recommend for Massachusetts then? What should they do, those that would like to defeat this particular ballot initiative that will be...
Yes, if you'd like to defeat it, or if you need to know more about it, you need to just investigate. This is probably one of the most serious steps a state could ever take. And let me assure you, California has rejected their ballot initiative. Maine rejected their ballot initiative. There are good, solid reasons why. Please invest yourself into those reasons and take the time to understand how risky this ballot proposal is. I would highly recommend that people check out our Vermont site, the Vermont Alliance for Ethical Healthcare. They have some pretty good information there, and I believe you have some sites right there in Massachusetts already springing up. Is that right, Brendan?
That's correct. I think NoDoctorPrescribedSuicide.org is another one. Now, I wanted to ask you, the slippery slope we've seen in the Netherlands, and but what's gone on in Europe, and will we have things where we're going to, I understand they have, they do injections to kill you in some places.
That's right. That's right. And well, in the Netherlands, things are so far gone that they will not even consult with family members before a team of doctors will make those decisions. And they are already expanding that to very young people, teenagers, and even newborns.
Wow, that is incredible.
It can become very slippery very fast. It already seems to be slipping in Oregon from the early days. Certainly, it is the number of folks who are requesting that the drugs have gone up 450% since the law was implemented, and with very little safeguards and very little information, we just don't know whose lives have been placed at risk. This would be a sweeping change in the way we practice medicine. The Hippocratic Oath and the 2,500 years of history now that has separated doctor from being a killer and a healer, all of that would start to become undone. And that puts all of us at risk. We could say, oh, this is about terminally ill people and their choice at the end of their lives. No, this involves your medical doctors and your medical community.
Well, Mary, it's almost overwhelming when you think of it. I wanted to ask you one other question.
Sure.
The poor and the elderly and particularly like minorities, aren't they much more vulnerable than the well-to-do?
Well, and isn't that always the case? And yes, and that is why the disability community coming out to speak for their membership, they already know how difficult it is for the folks they represent, the people in wheelchairs, the people in poverty. Vermont is experiencing a backlog of cases of abuse of vulnerable people, the elderly, young folks stealing their checks, forcing them into sad behaviors, leaving them in beds, and not helping them out and getting them cleaned up. We've got a backlog of things like that happening. So how can we ever be sure that someone isn't pressuring someone in an unfortunate circumstance to ask for the drugs? How could we be sure of that? And so that's the doubt that continues to niggle at the consciences, that it bothers the consciences of so many legislators who really are invested in creating good, safe public policy and would be willing to go out on a limb for something that they felt offered choice, but not if it was going to do more harm to more people than good.
I see. Well, Mary, thank you so much for being on the show today. We appreciate your insight, and you're right there in the battle in Vermont and have seen a lot and have seen this particular Vermont Alliance of Ethical Healthcare lead the charge. They've got a wonderful website, vaeh.org. I recommend everyone take a look at that website. It's chock full of very interesting and experiential facts that we should all look at before we vote on November 6th of 2012. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you found today's show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.